I know Twitch chat well, and I know YouTube pretty well. And the one thing that you and we all have in common is that we are so good at being armchair developers. So today, we're going to partake in our favorite activity and talk about why these masteries are garbage and why they need to be updated. If you've been playing Last Epoch recently, you know that there are some masteries that are like new and they're awesome and they're exciting and they got really cool stuff going on. In order, we've had things like Druid introducing all the new masteries, including Swarmblade form. We've had things like Rune Master being updated to the game, which outdated some of the other stuff that is a little bit older. We'll talk about that later. And most recently, we've had Falconer, and we have had the addition of Warlock. Some really exciting masteries, cool signature skills, cool stuff that really ties the room together. And it's really exciting to play these builds and to explore the designs of what's available of piecing everything together. They're fun. And that's the most important thing to me. That said, there's some old things in Last Epoch. There's a couple. So we're going to be talking about 4 masteries here that are kind of dragging down Last Epoch. They're taking up space because they could be exciting and they're not. Every class in Last Epoch only has 3 masteries available. For example, as a Primalist, you have access to your Shaman mastery, your Druid mastery, and your Beastmaster mastery. And when you're playing a Druid, you also have access to the first half of the Beastmaster tree and the first half of the Shaman tree. So if one of them is lacking, that means that not only is their skill tree lacking here, like the first and the second half, maybe their skills are lacking as well, but they kind of drag down what is going on with the other 2 masteries. So these are things that are old. They're not necessarily bad, but many of them are. But they're old, they're outdated, they're boring, which to me is the worst offender because they're just not exciting to play, and this is a video game, so let's make something fun happen. We're going to talk about design space for a handful of masteries, 4 of them I said. We're going to talk about signature skills. So to me, I'm using the word signature skill to denote something that you get as soon as you do mastery, around level 15, 16, 17. So for Shaman, it would be a Storm Totem. For Druid, it would be Werebear form. And Beastmaster's signature skill would be Summon Raptor. So that's what I'm using that vernacular to mean. In terms of signature skills, there's some that are like modern, and there's some that have really good cohesion between, like, they represent good cohesion between like the other skills in the mastery, and they kind of fulfill what that class or what that specific mastery wants to be doing, which means like 80 or 90% of that mastery will be using that signature skill. So for example, if you're a paladin's going to be using Holy Aura. And technically, I mean, I've played paladins that don't spec into Holy Aura, or maybe they have it on their bar, but they don't spec it, or maybe they just don't spec it at all because you want something else instead. Holy Aura as a paladin, as their signature skill, is something that 80 or 90 or maybe even 95% of paladins want to spec into. And it represents good cohesion. It has some generic buffs. It has some like active components to it that you can scale for damage, attack speed, cast speed, throwing stuff, maybe some defensive nodes as well. And that is something that I like. So a good example of like a modern mastery, in my opinion, would be something like Falconer. Falconer's mastery Falconer's signature skill is the Falconry node. You can use this for damage itself by using Falcon Strikes. You can get various buffs from it. You can get like offenses, defenses. You can do throwing stuff. It's good. You can even use it to augmenting your own throwing attacks on the top left with the Acid Flask things. Another example is like Warlock, surprise, another one of the new ones. But Thonic Fissure unites things so well that perhaps it's even too good at dictating what the rest of your build looks like as a Warlock character. But Thonic Fissure is a great example of a skill that ties things together, even if it might do that too well. An example of a signature skill that I don't like is something like a Void Knight's Erasing Strike. So this is like, you never use it for support. You don't use it for buffs. You don't use it for any particular reason unless you're bonking something over the head. So there's a lot of variety in Void Knight builds, but most of them, basically all of them, will be using Volatile Reversal and Anomaly. So I would say like maybe for a signature skill for Void Knight, you could swap this over to Anomaly instead, and all of a sudden it starts to make more sense. This is a skill you get nice and early. It augments the rest of your skills. You can use it for defense. You can use it for offense. You can use it to augment your ailment builds. You can use it for, CCing enemies. Anomaly seems like the kind of skill that should be the signature skill instead. Real quickly before we move on to the rest of the discussion, but things like Summon Wraith as a druid. What's the one that I never ever click on because I don't like minion builds? Necromancer. Summon Wraith is a Necromancer. It's basically only one build, Summon Wraith build, or with like the David Harbor helmet. But something that every single build would spec into is Dreadshade. And like if you've played a Necromancer in the past, you know that the worst part of your leveling is before Dreadshade, and the best part of your leveling is after Dreadshade. Because Dreadshade is kind of a slog to finally get to Dreadshade. But Dreadshade's really the reason for the season. It augments your skill, it gives you attack, defense, single target. It can proc other skills as well. It can give you extra armor. Like it seems like the kind of skill that ought to be a signature skill. Another one might be Summon Raptor. Summon Raptor is a Beastmaster. It's only one skill, as opposed to Summon Frenzy has synergy with all kinds of different summons, and it could even be used for augmenting yourself if you want to play like a self-damaging melee crit Beastmaster build, for example. So that's what I'm using to describe signature skills. And I want to outline that right now as like examples of signature skills that I do like and examples of signature skills that I don't like, because we're going to talk about that in the 4 masteries here. So let's get started on the very first one. The 4 masteries that are dragging down Last Epoch with just how old they are. To no one's surprise, the first one we're talking about here is Forge Guard. So Forge Guard exists. Whew. All right, yeah, so it's not much. So I recently did an analysis of, or I guess I did an overview of all the skills that were being used on the ladder and which masteries had the most diversity in their ladder builds after 1 month of pushing in 1.0, and which masteries had the least diversity. And Forge Guard was definitely the one that had the most diversity because no one's playing it, because no one's competing on it. So like everyone's kind of all over the place, and like surprise, it's Healing Hands is the best thing to be doing on Forge Guard, because Healing Hands is the best thing to be doing on everything. But I digress. What, in terms of design, is good about a Forge Guard? What makes you happy? What is something that you could further double down on thematically in order to make Forge Guard more interesting? So the things that we have in the good category, let's pop open the mastery tree. First one is the two-handed bonuses. Things like Smelter's Might, getting you doubled for two-handed weapons. I think that's quite good. This is a node that I called out specifically because using this along with Malin's Hubris, it's cool because you have Bleed and Ignite, and then Malin's unites that all into Ignite Chance and your unique glove slot. And it's a cool way of building your damage. The two-handed bonuses that go from Molded by the Forge, this is one of the best nodes in Forge Guard, which is saying something because Forge Guard's mastery is kind of all over the place. But it is truly a good node. So this kind of stands out to me, the two-handed bonuses for Forge Guard. Another thing that stands out for Forge Guard is like the bonuses per forged weapon. And it's not explicitly on the forged weapon skill tree, but there's a set. I know, a set that comes out with some frequency in Forge Guard builds. And that's the Forge Guard helmet. Just Sun Forged Great Helmet. Not the weapon, not the body armor, but this in particular has some good synergy in it. This is increased armor per forged weapon and flat health regeneration per forged weapon. You could even double down and use something like Vessel of Strife, which turns your health regeneration into ward generation, and you could build kind of defense based around that. This helmet and the fact that it is like it works with the forged weapons, and forged weapons are like a Forge Guard only thing, really seems like one of the best things that Forge Guard has going for it, thematically speaking. There's something that I wrote down when I was taking notes for this. I called it increased effective gear. And there's 2 things that really stand out for me that are really cool about Forge Guard, and you could use these to thematically make Forge Guard more interesting. And one's in Rive. It's a relatively new node called Foe Cleaver. And I want to call this like a Forge Guard node because before it, there's Forged Weapons, and after it, there's Forged Weapons. So right here, it's a two-handed thing, which seems to be like a thematically something that's interesting for Forge Guards. And this is it. So increased effective stats on two-handed weapons. If you think about what a Forge Guard could be, they are forging their weapons, and they're so good at crafting stuff and hitting anvils with hammers and building stuff. It kind of reminds me of Ornn from League of Legends. Like, your character, your gear is better than theirs because you made it better. And this kind of node on Foe Cleaver, along with nodes in Manifest Armor, they give you increased effect of the stats on your character. That's interesting. I think Last Epoch would do well to double down on this. For Forge Guard, even though I don't like minions, there are good minion synergies, and that's something that I would call good for Forge Guard overall. Preserving the forged weapons and the manifest armor. I'm not really a minion gamer, but that is cool, and I do put it in the good column. So for Forge Guard, what's bad? It's old. It's old. So most of the physical and fire resistance passive stuff that you see like this comes from, I guess this was initially in the game back when, what do you call it? The protection system was in the game, which was a different type of defense other than resistances. Now, not all of them. Warlock is the more recent one. It has fire and necrotic resistance in it, and the necrotic res obviously works with other sources or other payoffs for stacking necrotic resistance. Because as a warlock, if you stack necrotic res, you get all kinds of stuff. So maybe we could have that here as well. But Forge Guard, basically, it's old. The mastery is famously spread very thin. Basically, as long as you're specializing in a throwing, one-handed, two-handed, crit, melee, ranged, minion, ailment, block, armor, potion build, the mastery is perfect. No notes. Ship it. Yeah, as long as you're specializing in one of those things, Forge Guard has something for you, which frankly is too thin, and it is not good. So we don't have enough focus in Forge Guard. You don't have enough payoff. The other thing that we would call as a negative for Forge Guard is just minion survivability. The forged weapons, they don't do that well at high corruption. Corruption's kind of weird post 1.0 in last Epoch, but let's disregard that for a moment. They don't scale well defensively. They're cool offensively. They have a little bit of AoE damage that they've recently been buffed to do, and we already know that EHG is interested in increasing minion survivability. So this would be a great place in order to do that. So what's the recommendation? What can we do in order to make Forge Guard more interesting? Which of those themes can we double down on, and what kind of design space can we push into? So for me, I would say that instead of being a jack of all trades, master of nothing, or a king, 10, 9, like an 8 of all spades, instead, I would say that they ought to double down on the two-handed stuff and trim away the throwing, the one-handed, and the block things. And I think now would be a very good time to trim away the block synergies that Forge Guard has, even though you would normally think of Forge Guard as like the tanky paladin, or like the tanky shield-wearing guy. We don't need that, because we have Paladin, who even has their block synergy at the top half of the skill tree, kind of cementing it as what they have, and even block synergy in Holy Aura. Forge Guard instead could make use of a brand new layer of defense that just got introduced in 1.0, Parry Chance. So putting Parry Chance into Forge Guard would do two things. First of all, it'd be an interesting conversion. You could say Block Chance is converted into Parry Chance, and Parry Chance is strictly better than Block Chance because it doesn't require any source of block effect to go along with it. But it also caps at 75%. So there's like an interesting trade-off, and you could have like reduced effectiveness of the conversion between those things. But in any chance, Parry Chance, sorry, in any case, Parry Chance would be good at giving Forge Guard another interesting layer of defense to go along with his two-handed nature, which is what I'm advocating for. Having Parry Chance on a weapon for a Forge Guard would even go over into your forge weapons, because your forge weapons are a copy of your weapon, and you could have like an increased effective parry chance in your weapons or something along those lines, and parry chance would increase the survivability of your forge weapons, which would fix one of the issues that we already called out previously. The other thing that I would advocate for in Forge Guard is changing what the signature skill is. Forge Strike has only a small degree of synergy between the rest of the Forge Guard skills because it happens to be the thing that you can spec into in order to juice up your Forge weapons. I don't think that's enough. I'd advocate for something else instead. I want Forge Guard's mastery skill, the signature skill, to be Manifest Armor. And I think this would be a really cool change. Manifest Armor represents an idiot minion who has way too much damage. Frankly, Manifest Armor needs to be nerfed at some point because it's been unchanged since the addition of legendary affixes on your unique items, which represented a huge boost in damage. The thing that holds Manifest Armor back is the fact that most Manifest Armor builds are Forge Guard, and nobody wants to play them. And the fact that it's a minion, and some people just hate minions, and it's got goofy AI. It's not slow. In fact, it might even be too fast because it gets increased effect of your boots. So what could Manifest Armor do? Instead, we could change Manifest Armor to be more like Holy Aura, more like Anomaly, more like other signature skills that give you a buff to your own character. And we can change Manifest Armor into, maybe it's a minion, but maybe I can spec it to be something that I put on myself. Think Iron Man suit from the Marvel universe. You have increased effect of your boots, increased effect of your gloves, because you crafted them, and you're the Forge Guard, and you craft your gear better than anyone else. I think that'd be a really interesting way of making Forge Guard a little bit more interesting in terms of gearing even, and I don't know, bring it into the modern design space of Last Epoch. So that's Forge Guard. We have 3 more masteries to discuss. Let's talk about the next mastery that is dragging down Last Epoch with how old it is. To no one's surprise, it's Shaman. So Shaman has some good stuff going on. As a note, briefly, when I was generating my list of things that I want to change specifically and my recommendations, Shaman was the hardest one for me to come up with because it's that bad, because it's boring. In the mastery, there's just so many nodes that you could delete, and most people would never know that you even deleted them. There's so many nodes in Avalanche that you could delete that most people wouldn't even know that you deleted them. So the design space, in a manner of speaking, is wide open, which is kind of a good thing, right? I'm excited for the rework to Shaman because I think there's so many fun things you could do. So in the same order of operations, we're going to go good stuff, bad stuff, and recommendations. What's good about Shaman? Well, Shaman recently got the Stormbolt rework in the top half of the skill tree. You can use attacks to proc Stormbolt. You can use spells to proc Stormbolt, and then you can double all those Stormbolts with a small cooldown. These are pretty cool stuff. I like this a lot, and it really did a lot to unify some of the skills. Tornado procs Stormbolt, Earthquake procs Stormbolt, Avalanche and Summon Storm Totem don't, but it's still quite interesting. So Stormbolt, I think, was a great step in the right direction. We're kind of modernizing what Shaman is. In terms of stuff that's good, this totem synergies, I would definitely try to preserve that. One of the best nodes in Shaman is at the very top, this Ascendant Circle. And this, you see Shaman builds try to use an idol that procs a Thorn Totem on hits, and then they spec into Thorn Totems, and they have like the 5 Thorn Totems that all proc at the same time. And then the more totems you have, the more spell damage you have. So it kind of harmonizes spell builds and minion builds, and you can even try to scale both of them at the same time. It's quite cool. So I like this. Other things that are good for Shaman, I just mentioned the idols. I think some of the most interesting idol affixes in the whole game belong to Primalist and specifically to Shaman. Just procking stuff is very cool. Proc builds on Shamans are exciting. They tend to be some of the coolest stuff that people ever come up with, which is like Avalanche Boulders, Aftershocks from Earthquake, Stormbolt procs in different ways. They are very cool. For Shaman has a history of being good for Frostbite builds ever since the introduction of Frostbite Shackles, because Frostbite Shackles scales your ward retention based on cold res, and you get a lot of cold res from your passive and from this node here, Protective Circle. So ward builds or resistance stacking builds are a cool thing that Shaman has access to. If we had, and it'll continue to be more interesting the more resistance stacking payoffs we get in the game. So I think the Avalanche skill tree is the last thing that I want to call out as something good about Shaman. And this might sound weird to you, unless you've looked at it or really thought long and hard about Shaman. Avalanche's skill tree is a great example of a skill tree in Last Epoch that is interesting. It dynamically changes the skill. It changes how the skill works. It's got minions, it's got channeling, non-channeling, conversion stuff in it. But it's not overrun with more multipliers. There's actually very few more multipliers in all of Avalanche's skill tree. So you're free to spec it however you want. Now, free to spec it however you want, Avalanche kind of sucks. There's not really many things you can do with it, but the skill tree, the outline of the skill tree and how it's made, how it's not overrun with more multipliers is a very good thing, and I think it's worth shouting out. So, what's bad about Shaman? It's old. It's just old. It has long cooldowns on the interesting nodes. We have nodes like this. Chance to cast Maelstrom when hits. That is kind of cool. But it's got a 5-second cooldown. Wow, that's a long time. Yeah, that's what an exciting way to have action in my action RPG. So nodes like this are kind of all over the place. There's a Beastmaster tax that we talk about when it comes to Primalist builds, and that is putting in at least 8 or at least 13 or at least 20 or so points, getting all these points into the Beastmaster skill tree in order to get relevant defenses. There's a new node in Shaman that kind of helps to fix that, which is 5 or maybe 8, but realistically 5. 5% less damage taken from shocked enemies based on this conflux node here. I'd like to see more of this, but it's a tiny little bit of defense. We really need more defenses. After that, I would just say Shaman's Mastery is boring. And that's not surprising to anyone who's read the skill tree. It is slightly more interesting than the Falconer skill tree, I guess, but they're both quite boring. So what are the recommendations that we can do for Shaman? What can we do here? This was the hardest thing for me to come up with because I think Shaman's pretty wide open in terms of design space. So here's what we came up with. We said, going back to the signature skill for Storm Totem, wouldn't it be interesting if it's synergized with more skills and more playstyles? So in terms of utility, Storm Totem can chill enemies, and it can give you movement speed. It can give you some melee lightning damage, I suppose. It's really not much. You're basically using Storm Totem for movement speed and be nice and zoomy, or you're using it for damage, or both. It'd be nice if Storm Totem kind of unified more skills together. And the recommendation that I came up with here is this discharge node. It says Storm Totem casts Lightning Nova when it dies. So there's some archetypes in Last Epoch that are like Totem Pop. The most famous of these would be like Thorn Totem. You cast Thorn Totem really, really, really fast, and you're basically scaling this node. When it dies, it releases a Poison Burst or a Cold Burst if you have it converted, and you can scale that damage quite well. So Storm Totem could double down on that and could have a similar thing going on. So instead of proccing Lightning Nova, it could proc something else. And procs are, in my opinion, one of the most interesting things that Shaman has going for them. So this could be like a Tornado. It could be an Avalanche Boulder. It could be an EQ Aftershock. It could be something that synergizes with one of those interesting idle affixes that's already in the game. I think there's a lot of design space that you could do with nodes like this. Get the mana cost nice and low. Maybe use something that says minus totem mana cost in your mastery or on a unique axe. And then you just spam your totem over and over. And that would represent a new playstyle that kind of harmonizes what other skills are doing. So that's the kind of thing that I would want to see for Storm Totem. Another thing that I'd like to see is attunement being explored. So attunement is one of the most flexible things. Attunement's not very good by itself. It gives 2 flat mana and 4% increased damage for attunement scaling things. But it also has like other things that scale well with attunement too. Things like in Druid, Harmonious Wisdom, which gives you crit avoidance per 5 attunement. So you could have more attunement payoffs in the top half of the Shaman skill tree. I think there's a great space for that. I don't know about less damage taken, but maybe some other kind of scaling payoff. Maybe something that gives you like Fizz Res per attunement, or you could go crit avoid, you could go, I don't know, movement speed even, because movement speed kind of doubles down on Shaman. The history of Shaman being like a runner build with lots of movement speed, especially from things like Storm Totem. So something with attunement in the top half of the skill tree I think would be quite nice, but I'm not sure exactly what. I would like to see special totems in the Mastery skill tree. So think about Warlock, think about Rune Master, think about how in Rune Master you can proc different brands, and some of those brands can even be scaled by stacking things like Shock Chance or Chill Chance. There's curses in Warlock. Some of them you can even scale and make an entire build around. Things like Anguish in the Warlock skill tree. Those are cool, and you can use those as like a fundamental thing for your entire build. In Shaman, you could have new passives in here that say like, if you do this, you get a totem. If you do this, you get a totem. It lasts for 8 seconds. Maybe those totems scale. Maybe they scale off of resistances, which is something that you already have in spades as a Shaman. But what this would do is everything that says per active totem, like this spell damage per active totem, you would scale this as well. You could even solve one of the problems of being a Shaman, which is relative lack of defenses, by having less damage taken per active totem. And then you have Thorn Totems procced off of your what's the word for it? Off your idols. You could have like 3 or 4 different totems that are spec'd here. You could use Eterra's Blessing to get a totem. You could swipe to gain mana back, and your swipe creates a swipe totem as well. You could have all these different totems active, and maybe you even detonate those totems with a upheaval totem, like consuming totems and dealing more damage. That'd be a really interesting way of like getting Shaman as like the totem guy, which is not necessarily scaling totem damage, but it's scaling totems as ways to get other bonuses as well. So, slightly off topic, because we mentioned Swipe Totem already. Swipe has this node up here. Like, it's just kind of embarrassing that this node only works on kill. I would love for this node to work on single target as well. Chance to proc on boss hit, chance to proc on rare hit, something along those lines to help me use this to kill tier 4 Julera, for example. So, that is 2 masteries. Let's talk about the 3rd mastery. What is it going to be? Can you guess? Can you fast forward? Can you read my mind? Are you in Twitch chat right now guessing what it's going to be? It's Sorc. I made a video at the very beginning of 1.0, and I had 14 starter builds that I recommended for people who are brand new to Last Epoch. And as a joke, it was 14 and not 15. I left off one of them, and I left off Sorc, and I did not recommend any Sorc builds. So I've been on the record, and I'll go on the record again, saying that Sorc is not weak. Sorc is very similar to the other masteries that we've discussed here, old and boring. And it is being overshadowed by the more recent additions to the game, like Rune Master. So you can make good Sorc builds. You can crush 1,000 corruption. You can do well on the arena ladder as well. But is it boring? Is it interesting? Is it exciting? Are there compelling reasons to do this, or are you just doing this to be different? I think I know the answers to all the questions, and I think you do too. So what's good about Sorc? Well, Sorc has very cool, flashy skills. Visually speaking, they're very cool. So we have things like Meteor, we have Black Hole, we have Ice Barrage and Static Orb. They're like these big, flashy skills, and they are cool. So I like those a lot. You have access to cooldown recovery speed in your mastery tree without needing to stack intelligence. So if for some reason you are like playing a build that wants to stack, I don't know, something else, you don't need intelligence in order to get your cooldown recovery speed, whereas Rune Master needs to stack a whole bunch of int in order to get this. So it's very good. It's probably the best stat in the game for people who make use of it, but that is a differentiating factor there. The mini update that introduced thresholds was great for Sorc. A couple thresholds here, a couple thresholds there, including the lost knowledge one. Yeah, these are very good additions to the game. But all those thresholds, Rune Master also has access to them. So even though it's cool that you get spell crit, Rune Master also gets spell crit. So there's just very, very few distinguishing factors between the two. So what are the bad things about Sorc? Again, there's a theme. It's old. It's just old. The Mastery passive gives you plus 50 mana, and spells deal increased damage equal to the mana cost. It's not enough of a payoff. This is like a little bit of percent increased damage. It's not enough. You get a clunky playstyle when you have huge mana cost skills, and you have clunky mana. So you have to deal with those in some form or fashion. Maybe even using focus. Yikes. Some people like focus. I'm a big disbeliever in focus. So that's just me. Generally speaking, the issue with Sorc is that Rune Master does it better. And the skills that you get from being a Sorc, things like Meteor, Arcane Ascendance, and Black Hole, they're just not sufficiently compelling to play an actual Sorcerer instead of a Rune Master. So what's the recommendation? We have a couple things here, and let's start out with this. Arcane Ascendance. I think Arcane Ascendance would be a great addition as the actual signature skill for Sorc instead of Meteor. And so I think one of the big reasons people don't use Arcane Ascendance is that it locks you in place and you can't move anymore, and that's boring. I would love to see Arcane Ascendance only slow your character instead of locking you in place. I think a lot of people would be willing to play with something that slows you down and applies a slow to your character instead of something that actually just locks you in place and you're standing still and then you're dead. So I think there's really not much you need to do to Arcane Ascendance to make it good. I would love to see that change. So to differentiate Rune Master and Sorc, I would like to have a thematic difference between the two, and even moving some things around. So Rune Master already has lots of things that deal with ward generation, ward on cast, ward on this, ward on that, all these things, even ward on crit at the very top of the skill tree. Sorc already has this like identity of having big mana cost skills. I would like to see Sorc as the mastery that has the mana synergy to counteract Rune Master that has the ward synergy. So I would even move a couple things around. Rune Master, on top of having all this ward synergy, also has this node Cerulean Runestones, which gains a percentage of your maximum mana as endurance threshold. So remember, Fractured Crown works different than it used to. We're not going to talk about that here. But this kind of node, EHG has said that they're interested in rebuilding the synergy between mana and endurance. And I think that when they do that, they should do that on Sorc to make things like damage dealt to mana before health, make things like Fractured Crown, make things like damage dealt to mana even before ward. I think that works in the Flame Ward skill tree itself. Those kinds of things are very interesting, and I think Sorc would be a good home for them, along with these big mana cost skills and these big mana pools that you see on Sorcs, but you don't see as much on Rune Masters. So that's the place that I want to see that. So maybe instead of having increased increased damage equal to this mana cost, I don't think this is enough of a payoff. I think you could honestly just make this more damage equal to the mana cost. Like Glacier deals 40% more damage. Maybe there's something else that you need to update, because Glacier is also just an old skill. But having that more damage instead of increased damage, it actually kind of works out well when you compare it to something like Warlock, who gets more damage per curse on an enemy. So it's not out of place to have a more multiplier in your Mastery passive. Slightly off topic, there's two things that I want to talk about when it comes to Sorc. One is that Sorc and Runemaster, one or maybe the other could lean more toward being tri-elemental, whereas the other one could lean away from being tri-elemental. You see at the top of the mastery trees, we have Runemaster with these 3 separate sources of flat damage, and you can even proc all 3 of them while using your Rune Bolt, which is pretty cool. Sorc has these Dragon Mage and Dragon Breath stuff, and you can technically use these, and I've technically done stuff in the past, but I'm going to call these 3 nodes here. These are nodes that reward you for having like a tri-LE playstyle, for the most part. And I'd like to see one of these masteries have that identity at the top of the skill tree, and the other not have that at the top of the skill tree, just to differentiate them a little bit more. There's a personal item that's in the game. It's not an experimental item, but there's a personal item in the game that has hybrid penetration on it. Taking that kind of hybrid penetration affix and moving it to an experimental affix, or maybe putting it on a unique item somewhere, or just giving us more sources of hybrid penetration or elemental penetration. I think it's happened a little bit over like the past year or so, but I'd like to see more of it, because we clearly have sources of these hybrid flat nodes or these hybrid percent nodes, and I want to make use of them instead of just feeling bad for clicking on them. The second slightly off-topic thing when it comes to Sorc is mana spent gained as ward. So this is something that is kind of a Sorc thing. It's kind of a weird thing, honestly. So mana spent gained as ward is not particularly meta, but you can make good use of it in some particular cases. This node here, Lost Knowledge, is like the closest thing to like the mainstream uses of mana spent gained as ward. Post nerf, the only build that really uses this is Glacier. Pre nerf, every build used it because it was totally insane. So I'd like to see a change to mana spent gained as ward, and I'd like to move it closer to ward gain per second. So it would feel better if it were consistent generation instead of just like one big burst every 4 or 5 seconds, because you're playing a big mana cost skill. So big mana cost, mana gain on ward consumption, it's not going to work out too well. If you move it closer to ward per second, it'll feel better. So you could change it to mana spent gained as ward over 4 seconds. So if you spent 100 mana on a skill, you would subsequently get 25 ward per second for the next 4 seconds. I think that kind of a change would make the ward generation feel much better if EHG wants to preserve the ward generation in the current state that it is, because ward's pretty strong right now. Weird. We have talked about 3 separate masteries that are kind of dragging down Last Epoch. We talked about Forge Guard, Shaman, and Sorc. Talked about the good, the bad, and our recommendations for how to make them better. The last one that we're going to talk about is, can you guess? It's the mastery where it technically has good build, singular, not plural, and you spend 0 points in the mastery in order to make that build happen. So Marksman is definitely one of the masteries of all time. In the past, it's been pretty good. It's been pretty zoomy. It's had the most access to crit vulnerability before the crit vulnerability nerf. It's had some good defenses before the defenses got nerfed. And these days, the best thing that you can do with Marksman is to not spend any points in the Marksman skill tree and only use the Gelcor's daggers and throw explosive traps on the ground. The explosive traps generate dust shrouds for you, give you lots and lots of defense, probably too much defense. I think it's bugged. It gives you lots and lots of damage, definitely too much damage because I think that's bugged as well. But that build is insane, and it's definitely eclipsed any other Marksman builds. So I would say that at this point in time, about 2 months after the launch of the Last Epoch 1.0, there's basically one Marksman build that exists, which is very sad, in my opinion. So what's good about Marksman? Let's talk. From a design perspective, it's very good at supporting the mana generator and the mana spender playstyle. You can get a ton of mana out of the nodes like Mana Warp and even the base rogue tree, Sapping Strikes. It has very good support for life gain on hit, which is, it sounds like it's not relevant, but the life gain on hit on Marksman is so strong that it actually competes with how OP Leech is in Last Epoch. you might not believe this if you've only been playing Last Epoch since the 1.0 launch, but Leech has been something that we've complained about for a long time, because Leech is totally busting Last Epoch. And you might not know that right now because Ward has totally overshadowed it, which should kind of explain to you how OP Ward is right now as well for the builds that can support it, which is too many builds that can support it. So life gain and hit being so good actually incentivizes you not to be a Ward-based build, because then you can make use of that Ward gain on hit. What's bad about Marksman? Say it with me. It's old. And it's started to show its age here as well. I think of all the masteries that we talked about right now, it might just be an issue of the numbers not being big enough, of just not dealing enough damage. I think this is probably the mastery that needs the least amount of work on it, but we're going to talk about recommendations that we can make on top of that as well. The defense has been nerfed. In particular, Arrow Guard has been nerfed. So Arrow Guard, in my description, in the past, it was the only quiver that existed because it gave you up to 50% chance to a glancing blow, and it gave you a bunch of armor as well. And it had a low LP level, which means you can get it with 2 or 3 or even 4 LP in some scenarios. Why would you use any other quiver, which, by the way, the other quivers are limited and bad and boring. Why would you use anything else when you could just use an LP Arrow Guard instead? So the defenses on Marksman have been nerfed. Arrow Guard has been nerfed. Instead of other options being introduced to compete with Arrow Guard, they just nerfed Arrow Guard, which leaves Marksman defenses in kind of a bad spot. It's not bad overall. You still have like less damage taken when moving. You have some glancing blows. You definitely have dodge. You have life gain on hit and a ranged playstyle. You have things going for you. But I think the last thing that's really needed for like a bare minimum layer defense would be more access to glancing blows. And we'll get to that in just a moment. So Arrow Guard is an old item. It needed to be nerfed. It was really strong and really low LP level. It's kind of like Bleeding Heart, if I'm honest with you. But Bleeding Heart needs to be nerfed, and it'll be nerfed someday. So this needed to happen, but the fact that there's no compensatory buff or like other defenses introduced is definitely lacking. So we need some defenses here. Crit vulnerability is a big thing that's bad about Marksman right now. Crit vulnerability used to stack all the way up to 100%, but now it only stacks to 20%. So there was a brief moment in time when there was no compensatory buff for that. But these days we have bows that can have a extra affix on the prefix for the hybrid crit chance stuff. So this affix here. This was a great addition to the game, having that crit chance and bow attack speed here. It's additive. It's flat critical strike chance. But the fact that this is needed on all unique bows as well means like it's kind of hard to use a unique bow unless you have this bow crit chance on it as well. So it's kind of limiting in that regard. Other things that are bad about Marksman, crit bow Cinder Strike really stands out to me as something that's kind of a noob trap. And I hate noob traps because I want new players to have fun playing the game. There's a lot of people out there who like load up the game. They say they see Cinder Strike and they see like they're having fun at low levels and like, I'm going to play this skill, and it's garbage. It has like 0 more multipliers in it. It's got 1 on the first strike, and then people try to use the 30 mana cost thing, and it's such a mess. Having Cinder Strike as a viable skill that doesn't bait new players into using it as a primary source of damage, that would be a wonderful change. But let's move on real quick. Detonating Arrow is the what do you call it? Signature skill. It's the one you get around level 15 or 16 when you first get your mastery. And Detonating Arrow has some issues with it. One of the issues is that the base attack speed is quite low. It's much lower than you'd anticipate. Base attack speed is 1.222, as opposed to things like, let's see, Puncture is 1.467, quite a bit faster. I think 1.467 is the average speed that you see for most things in the game. What is Hail of Arrows? Hail of Arrows is actually quite fast, 1.1. Oh, sorry, 1.1. Wait, that's slow, right? 1.1 is slow? Yeah, I think 1.1 is slow. That's like a big damage over time skill. Let's move on. What is this? 1.467. Yeah, 1.467 is the default. So having things that are slower than 1.467, it does kind of feel awkward, and there's no particular reason the Detonating Arrow has to have a punishing attack speed to it. So this is interesting because the fact that Detonating Arrow is slower, and the fact that the most played Marksman build right now turns it into a trap and then attacks with explosive trap instead of self-attacking with this, it kind of mirrors something that happened a long time ago with Path of Exile. So there's a moment in time before things like Unleash or Intensity or Intensify support gems were added into Path of Exile, where self-cast skills just didn't have the same support. Why won't you just treat it, or why won't you just turn something into a mine? Why not just turn something into a trap instead? Why not just cast on crit this thing instead of actually casting your skill? So the trajectory of Last Epoch, in a small way, is actually mirroring the self-cast issue that Path of Exile had a long time ago. So I'd like to see something with regard to Detonating Arrow there. The other issue with Detonating Arrow, for those of you who played this game for a long time, is that too much of the fun and the excitement and the damage and the playability of Detonating Arrow is tied into the lightning tendrils. And unfortunately, if you convert Detonating Arrow into anything else, into fire or cold, you lose it. You don't, even poison, you lose your lightning tendrils. So the vast majority of Detonating Arrow builds don't convert because of this node out here. So that, to me, is criminal. Generally speaking, I think Marksman suffers from a lack of projectile behavior. You could explore a lot of design space. We have Pierce, and Pierce is in a number of places, like with Puncture or with Multi-Shot, piercing every enemy, or piercing most enemies. But we could explore things like Fork, or Bounce, or Return, or Chain. And all of those are not in Last Epoch, and they represent lots of ideas or opportunities for scaling damage, or introducing new interesting stuff to the game. So we could definitely explore all of those. So, for Marksman, what can we do in order to make it more interesting? How can we fix or change the design or recommend new frontiers for what Marksman can do? Like I said earlier, I think Marksman is probably the one here that suffers the least. We could just buff damage numbers. I think just buffing damage on Marksman would make it passable for a while. You don't need to rework everything in order to make Marksman fine, but just some damage numbers would be great. Speaking of signature skills, I would like Detonating Arrow not to be the signature skill. Instead, I would like to see a buff skill that harmonizes other skills, that ties the room together, that enchants my quiver and allows me to do something interesting. I think Dark Quiver should be the skill that marksmen get access to around level 15 or so. Something that, like, we shoot these arrows fall on the ground, we pick them up, and they buff our next skills. However, when it comes to Dark Quiver, most people hate it because of a lack of usability. People don't hate it because it's bad. People don't hate it because it's weak or something. They just hate the minigame, and they hate that it only applies to the next one arrow. So if we could increase the usability of Dark Quiver, we would have a lot of ripples across the rest of Marksman that I think would be quite good. So at base level, there's a couple things that I'd like to see. A pickup radius, larger circles on the ground where my character can like walk near an arrow, a black arrow that drops on the ground, instead of exactly on top of it. Just increasing the pickup radius, I think, would do a lot for Dark Quiver stuff. Holding multiple arrows. Right now, you can only hold one arrow, and then you shoot it, and you got to walk over another arrow, which is clunky, and it doesn't fit in how Last Epoch is played. It'd be a much slower game if that would be the case. So holding multiple arrows could be a nice way of making this happen. Another thing would be, after you pick up an arrow, it enchants your next arrows for the next 2 or 3 or 4 seconds. So if you picked up an arrow recently, these are the effects you have. Something along those lines, along with the pickup radius being increased, would greatly increase the usability and the popularity of Dark Quiver. So other things you could do, most people don't know that Dark Quiver is even weirder than you think it is. If you hover over it in letools.com, you'll see that it actually scales with cast speed. So rogues don't have any spells. They have access to Frenzy, and Frenzy gives you attack and cast speed. Wouldn't it be nice if Dark Quiver weren't clunky? Wouldn't it be nice if it scaled with attack speed, so that when you attack faster, you can use Dark Quiver faster? Yeah, if increasing the usability by making it scale with attack speed instead of cast speed, I think would be a great net positive. Another thing that we talked about is, actually, you know what? We have more changes to Dark Quiver, so you can fast forward if you want to, but we're going to talk about some dynamic changes to Dark Quiver, but let's talk about other general Marksman stuff first, and then we'll get to the big change. So, we talked about the flat critical strike chance, the hybrid modifier being introduced on bows, which means that you're giving up like attack speed or crit multi or flat damage. Actually, I'd like to see this moved. Somebody in Twitch chat recommended this, and I thought it was such a good recommendation. Think about a spellcaster. On a spellcaster, you can get crit chance or spell crit chance on your wand or on your staff. But if you're looking for flat critical strike chance, where do you get it from? By and large, you get it from your catalyst. which is the thing you use in your offhand, if you changed the flat critical strike chance affix, instead of being on your bow, and you put it on your quiver instead, this would do a couple things. First of all, it would mean that when you use a unique bow, you no longer need, at a bare minimum, a 1 LP unique bow. So currently, it even to like consider using a Reign of Winter, for example, you need a 1 LP and you need the crit affix on it, and then you're allowed to start playing the build because you don't have enough crit from other sources to make that build really pop off. So putting the crit affix on the offhand instead, first of all, kind of mirrors what spellcasters do. It frees up the opportunities to use more unique items without needing to get them with 1 LP. I think this would be a really nice change. I quite like it. Next up comes Detonating Arrow. Detonating Arrow, like, first of all, the Lightning Tendrils thing, to me, is, like, the most important thing. Let's change the attack speed of Detonating Arrow. Let's make it 1.467 like everything else. But as a design conversation, let's talk about this particular node with the Arcane Blast proccing the Lightning Tendrils. Instead of strictly disabling them when you convert Detonating Arrow into anything else, let's make some dynamic uses for what happens with this node when you convert. So currently, no one converts to poison, no one converts to fire, no one converts to cold because you lose this. But what if, when you converted, you got special unique effects per conversion? For fire, maybe you shoot out exploding fireballs. If you convert to ice, maybe the Lightning Tendril node converts into a piercing ice shard that shoots off into the distance. There's room to explore projectile behaviors here as well. You can make the Lightning Tendrils chain or fork or bounce or return or explode or any kinds of things. But this node, I think, is unexplored when it comes to the other conversions that are available on the Detonating Arrow skill tree. I said a moment ago that there was a big dynamic change that we could talk about when it comes to Dark Quiver. And this is hot. This is something that comes from Dread, who helped me brainstorm what are the kinds of things that we could do on a Marksman in order to make it spicier. And I like having Dark Quiver with a bigger pickup radius. I like having it maybe apply to the next 3 or 4 seconds instead of just the next one shot that I take. I like having it scale with attack speed. I think those are the kinds of things that are like kind of minimal, honestly, that would make Dark Quiver quite good. Usable, popular, a skill that people would enjoy using. On the other hand, if you wanted to do a more dynamic overhaul to it, here is a spicy idea. You could model Dark Quiver and the circles that it drops on the ground after Twisted Fate from League of Legends. So hear me out. You would have different colors of Dark Quiver circles that drop on the ground. You could have a yellow circle and a red circle, maybe a blue circle as well. And when you pick these up, maybe for the next 1 arrow, or maybe for like the next 2 or 3 seconds after this, but you shoot these arrows and they would apply different effects. So you pick up the red circle on the ground, and it gives you more damage. Pick up the blue circle, maybe enemies deal less damage to me. If I've hit them with the blue arrow, it applies a debuff to them. Or maybe a yellow arrow and it stuns the enemy and applies some CC. So the idea of this this setup, kind of modeling after something that exists in a different video game, is you could use the skill tree to alter and to fine tune the generation of which arrows that you want. Think about Runic Invocation, for example. Runic Invocation, you can fine tune it to only ever generate CFC to give you Rowan's Frostguard to give you less damage taken. And Dark Quiver, you could spec it so that only the blue arrows ever proc, and the blue arrows drop on the ground, you pick them up, you shoot enemies, and those enemies deal less damage to you, and all of a sudden you use it for defense. Or, with Runic Invocation, you could have it like proccing all kinds of stuff. Instead of taking the Immutable Order node in your Runic Invocation, you could just use whichever Runic Invocation comes up at the time. And there are people who are absolute lunatics who enjoy playing the game this way. So they proc CFC, Rowan's Frostguard, for defense when they need it, and they proc Hydrahedron for offense when they need it. I wouldn't do that, but allowing that playstyle to exist, I think, is a really good net positive. So you could have all 3 kinds of arrows dropping on the ground, and then when a blue arrow pops up, if you need it, you take it. If you don't need it, you don't. If you need the more damage from a red arrow that drops on the ground, you pick it up and you get more damage for the next 2 or 3 seconds. This is a really dynamic change that you could introduce to last Epoch, which again, it's like, ooh, it makes my brain bigger thinking about the possibilities of how you could change Dark Quiver from being a skill that everyone hates into being exciting. This is exactly the kind of thing that I want to see for last Epoch. Should this all happen in 1.1? God, no. 1.1 is much too soon for this. But talking about what I would like to see going forward for the 4 masteries that, honestly, they're just old and they're boring, and I really want them to be updated because they occupy a design space of Forge Guard putting on an Iron Man suit and having increased effect of all the modifiers that you wear and having these forged weapons floating around. It looks so cool. And having Marksman be like the only class that's kind of pigeonholed in the bows. You don't really have Marksman other than the one Marksman build that exists that uses daggers and throwing attacks instead, but that's the only one that exists. So Marksman is like the bow fantasy. I want more bow stuff in the game that's good and feels fun to use. And Shaman, all the Shaman builds, people show me Shaman builds all the time. And the most exciting Shaman builds and the builds that people are most excited to show to me are the things that proc stuff. And I think doubling down on that and having more procs for Shaman and having more skills tied together, more things procking Avalanche, and having more payoffs for it as well. Maybe like I said before, generating totems, then totems get exploded with upheaval, and then like you have less damage taken for totem on you. I think this is a really cool thing that you could make people happy about instead of just like the one lunatic who's still exploring Shaman, even though it's still relatively underpowered relative to everything else in the game. It's a fun conversation. This is definitely, when it comes to armchair development, this is armchair development. But I've been thinking about this kind of stuff for a long time, and it's fun to talk about. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see some of these changes happen in the future so that we're happier about playing these older classes. If you got an idea, let me know. I would love to hear it. I'll see you next time.